The desert doesn't keep secrets. It buries them under a shifting veil of red dust and bleached silence. For the millions who tuned in to Matt's off-road recovery, the screen was a window into a rugged brotherhood of steel, torque, and the camaraderie of the dunes. But among the roaring engines and the heroic rescues, one face, Katelynn, became a fixture, a calm presence amidst the chaotic machinery of the recovery business. Then, as abruptly as a snapped winch cable, she wasn't there. The internet, a beast fueled by speculation and fragmented digital breadcrumbs, began to feed. Was it a falling out? A private tragedy? A pivot toward a life untouched by the lens? Tonight, we peeled back the polished veneer of YouTube stardom to explore the quiet, human cost of fame, the weight of expectations, and what happens when the cameras stop rolling and the desert wind finally claims the silence left behind. The hum of the wrecker isn't just a sound. It is the heartbeat of a lifestyle. In the blistering heat of southern Utah, where the topography is carved by geological violence, the off-road recovery crew built a sanctuary of grease and adrenaline. Katelynn emerged not merely as a participant, but as a stabilizing force. In a world defined by the visceral power of internal combustion and the crushing weight of stalled vehicles, she represented a grounded, human contrast. The audience grew accustomed to her presence, a steady hand on the camera, a voice of reason when the recovery became perilous. She was part of the mythos. To the subscriber base, this wasn't just a show, it was an invitation into an extended family. Yet, there is a dangerous psychological trade-off in the world of digital creators. When you invite an audience into your life, they begin to feel an ownership over your trajectory. Every edit, every upload, and every framing decision becomes a contract. Katelynn, by simply existing within the frame, became a character in a story she didn't fully write. She was the silent witness to the peak of the channel's meteoric rise, the sponsors, the merchandise, the crushing pressure to keep the content pipeline flowing, and the reality that in this industry, if you aren't growing, you are dying. Beneath the surface of the polished, high-definition uploads, the atmosphere was shifting. The demands of a YouTube empire are relentless. The camera is a voracious master. It requires constant feeding, constant sacrifice, and a total surrender of the private self. For those behind the scenes, the line between doing a job and being the content begins to blur until it vanishes entirely. Katelynn occupied this volatile space, carrying the weight of being a fan favorite while navigating the internal friction of a rapidly scaling business. The desert sun began to cast longer shadows. The dynamic was evolving, shifting from a grassroots group of friends pulling trucks out of the muck to a sophisticated production house. The intimacy that defined the early days was being replaced by the cold, calculated efficiency of the algorithm. In the silence of the production office, the air grew thin. Decisions were made that would reshape the cast, the narrative, and ultimately, the trajectory of those who had once been the heartbeat of the show. As the cameras rolled, she played her part, but the lens captures only the light, not the exhaustion behind the eyes. The audience saw a recovery team, but she was increasingly feeling the need to recover her own sense of self. The machine was moving forward, but she was looking for the brakes. The crew was preparing for the next big build, unaware that one of the most vital components of their emotional foundation was already mentally miles away from the dunes. The transition was not a sudden explosion, but a slow erosion. In the world of social media, absence is a vacuum, and vacuums are meant to be filled with rumor. When Katelynn's presence on the channel began to wane, the comment sections transformed into a digital interrogation room. Every missing frame was dissected. Every lack of mention in a vlog was treated as a clue in a grand, unseen conspiracy. This is the cruelty of parasocial relationships. The audience, having consumed hundreds of hours of her life, felt a betrayal that was entirely one-sided. For Katelynn, the decision to step back was not necessarily a theatrical exit, but a fundamental human need to reclaim the parts of her identity that had been cannibalized by the screen. To be known by millions is to be misunderstood by millions. She was trapped in a narrative where she was either the villain who abandoned the ship or the victim of a corporate machine, neither of which acknowledged her autonomy. The psychological toll of this public scrutiny is a weight that few can truly comprehend. Imagine living a life where your every movement is judged by an invisible jury of strangers who view your personal life as public property. The silence from her end was not an admission of guilt, but a tactical withdrawal. She was seeking the solace of a life not measured by views, subscribers, or the fluctuating favor of an audience. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was strained. The business had reached a level of professionalization that left little room for the messy, human complexities of interpersonal relationships. When the cameras were off, the conversations were no longer about the joy of the trail, but about logistics, brand alignment, and the next fiscal quarter. The transition from friends working together to employees in a hierarchy is a death knell for many creative ventures. Katelynn felt the chilling breeze of this shift. She realized that she had been hired to be part of an adventure, but she was increasingly being tasked with supporting a product. The final days were quiet. There were no dramatic confrontations, no cinematic standoffs in the sand. Instead, there was the slow, painful realization that the version of herself required by the channel no longer existed. The screen reflected a person she no longer recognized. To stay would have been to perform a version of herself that was essentially a ghost. As the last piece of equipment was cleared away, the finality of the situation hung in the air like dust after a vehicle passes. The viewers would keep watching, the engines would keep roaring, and the recovery team would continue to pull trucks from the mud. But the departure of a key figure always leaves a hairline fracture in the foundation of the story. As the final video featuring her presence was uploaded, Katelynn walked away from the desert, leaving behind not just a job, but a persona that had consumed far too much of her soul. But the internet, as it always does, was just beginning to turn the heat up. The aftermath of a public departure is never truly silent. In the age of constant connectivity, the absence of an official statement creates an echo chamber where speculation becomes synonymous with truth. Almost immediately after Katelynn's final appearance, the digital landscape began to fracture. Reddit threads swelled with armchair detectives analyzing eye movements, analyzing the frequency of social media interactions, and dissecting the subtle shifts in the crew's body language. The psychological impact of such a phenomenon is disorienting. For those remaining on the channel, there was a mandate to keep the engine running, a directive that the show must go on, regardless of the personal fallout. But for the audience, the disruption felt personal. They weren't just losing a cast member, they were losing the sense of continuity that made the channel feel like a real-life soap opera. The "what really happened" narrative took root, nourished by the absence of a clear answer. Behind the screens, the reality was likely far more mundane, yet significantly more painful. It was the end of a professional chapter, the dissolution of a work-based friendship, and the quiet mourning of a shared dream that had shifted into a rigid business model. Yet, the audience demanded a villain. They demanded a dramatic revelation. They looked for signs of a fractured ego or a corporate betrayal. Katelynn, having stepped into the shadows, found herself living in two worlds. In one, she was a ghost, a name whispered in comment sections and theorized about in fan forums. In the other, she was simply a human being trying to navigate the mundane reality of moving on from a project that had defined her public existence. The dissonance is profound. When you walk away from fame, or even the fringe of it, you don't just leave a job. You lose your public identity. You watch as people create a version of you that serves their narrative, a digital effigy that has no connection to your actual, beating heart. The pressure mounted for the remaining cast to address the elephant in the room, but in the sterile, media-managed world of high-traffic YouTube channels, acknowledging the human element is often seen as a liability. Silence became the company policy. This silence, however, was not empty. It was pressurized, heavy with the weight of unsaid things and the inevitable resentment that festers when communication breaks down. While the channel continued to post high-octane content, the tone had subtly shifted. There was a performative buoyancy in the new videos, a desperate attempt to show that everything was better than ever. But to the keen observer, the cracks were visible. The missing energy wasn't just a loss of a personality, it was the loss of a dynamic. The machine was still operating, but it had lost a gear, and the grinding sound of the friction was becoming impossible to mask with editing or upbeat music. As the viewership numbers began to fluctuate, a new rumor surfaced, not about her departure, but about a tell-all interview that could potentially unravel the carefully curated image of the channel forever. Rebuilding an identity after the spotlight fades is an act of quiet defiance. For Katelynn, the time away from the lenses was not merely a retreat. It was a period of forced introspection. When you stop being a character for public consumption, you are suddenly confronted with the person underneath. This is the stage where the mask is removed, and the scars, both from the work and from the sudden, public nature of the exit, are finally laid bare. The psychological transition from content creator to private citizen is often romanticized, but in reality, it is a form of grieving. There is the mourning of the camaraderie, the loss of the adrenaline, and the confusing process of untangling one's self-worth from the validation of the algorithm. She found that the desert, once a source of professional purpose, was now a landscape she avoided. The red dust, the roar of the engines, the sound of the winches. These were no longer symbols of adventure, but triggers for the stress of a life she had chosen to leave behind. Yet, there is a paradoxical beauty in this darkness. By stepping out of the machine, she regained the one thing that the YouTube industry demands you surrender: autonomy. She stopped being a commodity. Her choices were no longer dictated by click-through rates, retention graphs, or the fickle whims of an audience that claimed to love her while dissecting her departure. In the quiet corners of her life, she began to find a new rhythm. It was a life of small, intentional moments, unrecorded, unedited, and therefore entirely authentic. There is a profound, meditative peace in doing something solely for the joy of it, rather than for the sake of the content. She began to understand that the downfall that the internet so hungrily speculated about was, in truth, a liberation. However, the world of the internet does not easily forget. Old clips still surface. Comments continue to trickle in on years-old videos. The legacy of her time on the show acts like a phantom limb, a sensation of something that is no longer there, yet still influences the way she moves through the world. The challenge of the rebirth is not just to build something new, but to ensure that the ghost of the old narrative does not haunt the new beginning. As she looked forward, she realized that her story was not a tragedy, but a transition. She had played her part, learned the cost of the digital age, and ultimately, prioritized the sanctity of her own mind over the ephemeral glory of the screen. The machine continues to churn, producing new faces, new dramas, and new, fleeting legends. But in the silence of her own life, Katelynn had found the ultimate victory: the right to be entirely, and finally, nobody but herself. A new, massive project for the channel is announced, and the rumors suggest they are trying to recreate the exact dynamic she once embodied, forcing the world to ask, is some lightning simply impossible to catch in a bottle twice?